Thank you. So my role is to be the, the bearer, if not good news, at least possibly somewhat encouraging news. Unlike Richard, I can't claim that Finland is my home so deeply as having been born here, but it certainly is the home of this project. And it's really been a pleasure for both of us to work with the Finnish Foreign Ministry and with FIIA from developing the basic beginning concept through to the conclusion of this project. So I'd like to add my thanks to them. So as Richard says, this is a challenging moment for supporters of multilateralism. And I think it's particularly a challenging moment for Europe because European countries and the EU, for us, multilateralism is, it's not just a kind of policy choice, it's almost part of the European identity to work in a multilateral way. And that's, of course, the EU in itself expresses a kind of multilateral vision that countries thrive best by working together, by pooling their resources, by operating according to fixed rules, and identifying the common interest. And so for the EU, I think it's, the commitment to multilateralism is real. And then beyond that, for small countries, as Europe is made up of, a commitment to a kind of open, rules-based system is really fundamental to pursuing their interests. Europe is not going to thrive in a kind of might-based world, but a multilateral world is almost an existential question for us. So what are the opportunities that exist in this moment of challenge for Europeans to help, to support, and we would also argue to kind of renovate the multilateral system, because as Richard identified in a number of ways, it seems to be, falling short or failing to meet some of the most pressing challenges of today. And we have identified it in the paper a number of ways that we see Europe as being comparatively well placed to take forward some sort of creative and constructive action in this area. And I should say a kind of a common element, I think, in all the opportunities that we've identified is this notion that Europe can identify partners to work with. Europe is not going to save the multilateral system on its own, but Europe can act as a kind of pole of attraction and as a convener to pull together a group, we think quite a widespread group of countries that in different ways and on different subjects, with different aspects of the multilateral system have a strong interest in keeping this kind of multilateral approach alive. So when we did the presentation of this report at the UN in New York, we did an event with the Finnish embassy there, and the ambassador spoke in his introduction of a silent majority of countries around the world that remained supporters and committed to multilateralism. And that's exactly what we're trying to identify, how the EU can pull those together and kind of present itself as the forum and the convener of those kinds of approaches. So what are the areas of opportunity? I think, the first is that in this world, as Richard said, where we see, I think increasingly a sense that on the one hand, a United States that's turning away from multilateral institutions, and on the other hand, increasingly powerful China that is more active, but perhaps guided by a set of values that may not in all cases be those shared by the Europeans, that there is a space opening up, and that the threat of a kind of bipolar US-China standoff with countries around the world forced to take sides in this kind of confrontation is one that many, many countries are uncomfortable with. And in that position, we see an opportunity for Europe to present itself as the kind of a neutral intermediary, a third party, an arbiter that can kind of be a pole for other countries to work around. And so, one illustration of this, if you look in the Human Rights Council, as the US has pulled back, in fact, Europe has been able to step forward and, as I'll discuss a little bit more in a few minutes, has been able to sort of build new kinds of coalitions in support of new issues. And we see that in other areas of the UN system as well, this kind of appetite for, for a way of doing things that remains multilateral in the sense that Europe has the kind of credibility to do this. And so we see, I think in the past there were times when some of these countries in the developing world might have looked at Europe through a sort of post-colonial mindset. But we see in this world where the kind of increasing dominance of the United States and China is to some degree allowing a reconsideration of that. And there's perhaps more responsiveness to the option of working with Europe as a country which is less pursuing a kind of agenda, driven by its own perceptions. Second is the idea that Europe has the kind of skills and experience to work effectively in the multilateral arena. So, Europeans are quite good at this. We're quite good at multilateralism. We have a lot of experience. As I said, this is something that is very deeply rooted in the European way of working. And the commitment and the knowledge of international law, the experience of diplomatic processes is kind of very ingrained within the EU. And if you look at the way that Europe has been working in the United Nations system, I think you can see the kind of centrality of its role quite well illustrated. So one of the figures that we give is that 80% of processes in the General Assembly, negotiation processes, have a European country either as a convener or with the sense of pulling in other countries and building partnerships as a co-convener. But Europe is really central to those processes and has the skills needed. And I think, again, if you look at the recent Climate Action Summit, European countries had a central role leading the working groups, 6 out of the 9 working groups that were active in the run-up to the Climate Action Summit were led by European countries. So there is that role, a central role and skills that we have. And the third area that we identified in the paper is, rather than just kind of falling back on these tried and tested ways of working, where Europe does have its comparative advantage, European countries are also showing an ability to innovate, to work flexibly. And as Richard said, there are these new challenges, and in various ways the EU, which has not always in the past been the most kind of flexible organization, is showing a capacity to innovate. So perhaps the central illustration of this is the idea of an alliance for multilateralism, which has been a big Franco-German initiative and attracting the support of other countries within Europe and outside Europe. This is an evolving process, and it's still likely perhaps to take the form of some sort of loose network rather than a formal alliance. But it's the focus of a lot of thought about how we can work in a new way multilaterally. So that would be one illustration. Another would be the Paris Peace Forum. Again, a new kind of format to address new kinds of issues. And you can look at some of the ways that European countries are working, for instance, on cyberspace. The Paris call for cybersecurity. Again, I think we see kinds of new ways of working coming out of these initiatives, ways that perhaps reach out beyond purely nation states to try and bring in civil society, to try and bring in corporations, to try and bring in sub-state groups, entities, regions, cities, in a variety of different ways. I think in climate action, in migration, in these kinds of cyber initiatives, we see I think a need to think in a more flexible way, and we see European countries acting in that way. And if you look at the cyber field, you can see the ability of Europe to develop new ways of influencing international processes. So, beyond the idea of kind of formulating a treaty to which countries will sign up and a formal process of that sort, we see these other ways of setting standards. And I think one example of this would be the GDPR, the Data Protection Regulation, which was originally a European thing, but which has emerged as the kind of global standard through a sort of this informal process of standard setting, partly using the weight and the influence of the European market, but also I think going back to what I said before, this notion of Europe as a credible standard setter, that perhaps has a vision which is not the rather market-driven approach of the United States, and perhaps not so much the statist approach of China, but one which expresses a conception of a certain set of norms, including human rights, as being expressed there. And so in those ways, I think we can see some scope for Europe to set the agenda in various ways. So in the final part of our paper, we look at how these kinds of approaches might work in a few select areas, areas where multilateral action is important. And the ones that we're looking at are trade, human rights, security, and cyber. As Richard said, other areas like climate are important, but there we see a process that's already kind of quite well underway. So just to talk a little bit about, I'm going to talk about two and then hand back to Richard to conclude with two more. I'll start with trade, not only because it's a particularly important one for European countries, but it's also a particularly timely one at the moment, because for those of you who follow trade issues, you may know that the term of office of two of the last remaining three judges on the appellate panel of the World Trade Organization has just expired. So as of now, as of yesterday, I believe, the appellate system at the WTO is no longer able to function. And this obviously has been at the core of the WTO system, the ability to come up with these binding rulings, and that's now in jeopardy. And of course, the reason that the judges are not being reappointed to fill the seats of those whose terms have expired is because the United States is blocking their appointments. And the US is doing that as part of a push against what it sees as flaws within the WTO appellate system and the dispute mechanism system more widely. But I think it's not only those concerns, which go back for a number of years, which reflect some long-standing American concerns about the operation of the WTO system, but it's also a reflection of this administration's rejection, I think, of a kind of rules-based approach to trade. On the other side to that, you have, I think, a sense which exists in the United States, but also more widely, that the entry of China into the WTO and the growth of the Chinese economy to the significant international position it has today, without kind of fundamentally changing its rather state-based approach, is one which perhaps the WTO rules didn't anticipate and are not well equipped to handle. So I think there are a number of countries, including in Europe and elsewhere, that feel that this situation creates a kind of unlevel playing field that systematically advantages China with its, its statist approach to the economy, state-owned or state-supported enterprises having a significant role. So if that's the threat to the system, what could be done to save it? And we think there is scope, as indeed the EU has been doing, for Europe to try and pull together some sort of middle ground So working perhaps with the United States to try and pull it back into supporting the system, and at the same time working with China and others to come up with some way of addressing some of the concerns that people have about some of the aspects of the operation of the Chinese economy. And I think we have to be realistic about, what we should aim to achieve. I think it would be unrealistic and, perhaps unreasonable to expect the Chinese economy to converge with and, fundamentally to change the way its economy operates in order to fit into the international system. If there is going to be a rules-based system, I think it has to be a system that deals with countries essentially as they are, but it would not be unreasonable to expect changes in terms of transparency and things like that. And similarly, I think we have to recognize that there's some justice to some of the US complaints, but equally that their approach of tearing down the whole structure is excessive. So that would be a possible middle way, but at the same time, I think that we should recognize the need for a kind of interim solution to keep the dispute settlement system running, and the EU has indeed explored these ideas of ad hoc panels using retired judges. I'll quickly say something about human rights. This is an area, I think, which is of significance and importance in this country and for many European countries. And here, as I said, there's no doubt that in some ways the climate is more difficult now for human rights within the multilateral system than it has been. We've seen, growing opposition in some quarters to the persistence of human rights positions within the UN Secretariat, cuts in funding for UN positions in certain kinds of for human rights positions in certain kinds of missions. And yet, at the same time, in other areas, the EU has been able to put together new and perhaps unexpected coalitions in support of human rights issues. So if you look at the Human Rights Council, for instance, the EU has been able to work out deals with the countries of the OIC, the Islamic countries, to pass a resolution on Myanmar. Similarly, it's been able to work with Latin American countries, the so-called Lima Group, to craft a resolution on Venezuela. In these respects, we see that the absence of the US has actually created more of an opening for the EU to put together coalitions. But in other respects, it remains a challenging environment, and one issue that has been significant for a number of European countries in relation to China is the treatment of the Uyghurs in China. And there, the EU has really been unsuccessful in building broader coalitions, and China, by contrast, has been rather more successful at winning adherents to its sides. So I think in human rights and more broadly in many of these areas, we should see the kind of multilateral system as in a kind of, relatively, the system is still there, it's still working, but there's some degree of competition within it. And in this respect, I think the role for the EU is to be quite bold and assertive in looking for ways to extend its reach, to reach new partners, and to win support for positions that I think might be more widely shared. So with that, to conclude, I'll hand back to Richard.
Thank you very much, Juha, and thank you to the Institute for the invitation to address this this excellent audience. Anthony and I, just to clarify, I am Richard, this is Anthony, if there's any doubt, are going to run you through the basic ideas in this paper, and then we're really looking forward to Kristi's comments and the wider discussion. I should say, before we get any further, that you will notice that both Anthony and I have classic English accents. And it may seem a little curious to have two men with English accents talking about Europe's influence the day before a Brexit-based election in the UK. But in fact, Anthony is secretly an American, and I was born in Helsinki, so I'm secretly a Finn, and it's very good to be home. The paper we lay out is, as you have said, based on a process of thinking that began at the start of this year with an excellent brainstorming deep in the snow in Mustio. And what Anthony and I have tried to do in this paper is really address two recurrent complaints that we were hearing at the start of this year about the state of the international system. The first of those complaints is that there is a crisis of multilateralism underway. And I think anyone who's followed international politics in recent years will have heard this phrase, the crisis of multilateralism, used very widely. However, it seemed to us that this was not a very well-defined term. No one was quite clear what they meant when they said there was a crisis of multilateralism. Secondly, during the period of the Trump administration in particular, we've heard a lot about Europe's waning influence in the global order, and especially Europe's waning influence in multilateral institutions. And I think, again, it's become quite a common meme to argue that Europe, whether as a whole or specifically the EU, is losing global influence. And so what we try and do in this paper is define more clearly what the so-called crisis of multilateralism is and whether it is real. Secondly, we look at Europe's influence in international institutions and ask whether Europe's decline is a reality. And then we look at a few areas where we think that European governments and the EU as a group could have more influence going forward. We don't try to cover every dimension of international diplomacy. There are some areas, such as climate change diplomacy, where there are evidently massive challenges, but actually Europe's diplomatic approach is quite well defined, and we didn't think we had anything to add in those cases. But there are a number of other areas, such as trade, human rights, and new technologies, where we felt we did have something to add. So let's look first at the so-called crisis of multilateralism. What is this? Trying to pick apart what is going on in the international system today, we concluded that there isn't a single crisis of multilateralism. In fact, there are three crises of multilateralism underway. And they are a crisis of power, a crisis of relevance, and a crisis of legitimacy. And I'll go through each of those in turn, and that will make you quite depressed, but then Anthony will come on stage and tell you the good news about Europe's influence. Crisis of power, crisis of relevance, crisis of legitimacy. The crisis of power is, I think, the one that is clearest to understand, and the one that is most obvious to anyone following the media. Since the Second World War, and certainly since 1989, the international system and multilateral institutions have ultimately been based on US power. And although the US has obviously had a tortured relationship with organizations like the UN during moments such as the Iraq War, ultimately Washington has continued to underwrite the multilateral system that we know. And other powers committed to multilateralism, including European powers, have built on this American bedrock. It is now fairly clear that the US is reconsidering its overall global commitments, and the Trump administration in particular does seem to be questioning its commitment to multilateralism, and clearly we've seen that in the US withdrawal from the Paris Climate Change Agreement, the US withdrawal from the Human Rights Council, UNESCO, and the Iranian nuclear deal. And so the basic US underwriting of the UN system is in question. Added to that, we see the rise of China changing political calculations in multilateral forums. We see China positioning itself as a potential alternative leader to the US on issues such as climate change. Now, I think it is very important to say that this is something to be welcomed, and that it is crucial to the future of the multilateral system that China does continue to engage with organizations like the UN. But it's also clear that for the US, the rise of China in multilateral organizations is a source of concern and a source of friction. Back in December 2018, Secretary of State Pompeo used a speech in Brussels to attack China's role in the UN. And sitting in New York or sitting in Geneva, it's increasingly clear that we're seeing growing bipolar tensions between China and the US in many multilateral forums. I see this in the Security Council, which is the one that I follow most closely. And over time, these tensions could paralyze significant parts of the multilateral system. And so the emergence of a new era of bloc politics, a new era of bipolarity, threatens to undermine the multilateral system that we know. Then there's the crisis of relevance. And the crisis of relevance in the multilateral system is not something that can simply be blamed on Donald Trump. And one thing that we did want to emphasize in this paper is that not everything that is bad with international institutions is Donald Trump's fault. More fundamentally, many of the multilateral institutions we know today are pursuing agendas that are antiquated, that may have made sense in the past, but do not necessarily make sense today. Much of the UN development architecture continues to follow approaches to development that simply are not really relevant in the modern economy, for example. UN peacekeeping missions and mediation missions, while playing a crucial role in Africa and the Middle East, seem to be struggling with a new era of conflict defined by asymmetric warfare and non-state armed groups. And so there's clearly a need to update what large parts of the multilateral system is doing. And simultaneously, we see very big gaps in the current international architecture around some of the most significant changes in our times. There is not yet any serious multilateral architecture for the control of artificial intelligence. There are huge tensions over how the UN should approach cyber issues. There was a very significant moment of tension a year ago, as you will remember, over the UN Compact on Migration, a major challenge which European countries in particular struggle to agree a multilateral approach to. So we think that too much of the multilateral system is trapped in the past, and too little multilateral effort is going into handling some of the most pressing problems of today. So that's the crisis of relevance, and that links then to a crisis of legitimacy, which is harder to quantify. But it is clear that in many parts of the world, publics and governments are questioning whether this system that we've been living with since the end of the Cold War really meets their needs. In much of Europe, it appears that publics do not feel that international economic cooperation has addressed the problems of inequality that are at the center of our domestic politics. And there is a populist streak which has taken advantage of this discontent and, frankly, is spreading incorrect stories about how the UN is trying to promote uncontrolled migration and so forth. There's a lot of lies about that particular issue, but the fact that those lies have some traction indicates to us that there are real doubts in European populations about the international system's responsiveness to their needs. In other regions, you find, I think, African governments increasingly looking to the African Union or sub-regional organizations as more natural and more legitimate organizations to meet their challenges. And in the Middle East today, frankly, the UN's reputation, never high, is at an all-time low because of public disgust over the organization's failure in Syria. And so there is the crisis of legitimacy, the crisis of relevance, and the crisis of power. Now, at this point, we could all stop and go out and find a drink because it's a fairly depressing survey of the situation. But we also conclude that the picture for Europe is not quite as bad as you might assume. And that's where Anthony enters the picture.
Thank you, Anthony. I will be very brief. The great Max Jakobsen once said that the great quality of Finnish diplomats was that they used fewer unnecessary words than other diplomats. So I will learn from that. The other two areas we look at in the paper are firstly European security cooperation with Africa, and secondly the control of new technologies. These are very different areas, but we do see space for European action in both cases. I think there is a growing tendency, which we should encourage, towards the EU and the EU's members finding new forms of security cooperation with the African Union and other African organizations to tackle threats such as terrorism in the Sahel. And I think there's a lot of openness, actually, from African organizations and African leaders to that sort of cooperation. We say more in the piece about what that might look like. And then, finally, we look at new technologies. And we argue that, as I noted at the outset, new technologies are a space where there is a real shortage of governance mechanisms. There is no effective multilateral governance system for artificial intelligence. There is very little for the governance of cyber issues. And although China and the US are leading powers in terms of developing these new technologies, Europe does actually have the economic power and the leverage to help set some of the rules of the road for how these technologies are used. Anthony mentioned the example of the GDPR regulation. And we would argue that it's in the space of setting rules for new technologies that Europe can really use its economic weight to establish new forms of multilateral cooperation. Now, these are themes that we were working on at the start of the year, but I'd end by noting that they're two themes which the incoming EU leadership in Brussels have taken up. And not, I think, because of our own genius, but we were lucky. You may have seen that Ursula von der Leyen, the new Commission President, made her first trip to Addis Ababa to meet the African Union. And I think that we can feel confident that the EU system is going to invest more in AU relations over the next 5 years, with a view both to promoting prosperity, but also to controlling migration, controlling refugee flows, and challenging security threats on Europe's southern flank. And it is very clear from a number of speeches and statements from the new Commission that digital issues and the governance of new technologies are going to be very high on this Commission's agenda. I was in Brussels on Monday talking to EU officials, and they very much emphasized that the primary multilateral focus of this Commission was likely to be on new ways of governing the digital sphere. So I think we already see ambition, actually, with the new EU leadership, supported by countries like Finland, to do more in this multilateral space. All this paper has been able to do is maybe lay out the case for doing that, but we hope that it's a useful contribution at this time.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. It's always very nice to be back to FIIA and to add one more voice to this discussion from another small state, coming from Tallinn, but in fact I am also almost a Finn, like Richard. I'm afraid I will be a bit more pessimistic, or at least skeptical, to keep the balance. And also to not to be too boring for the audience. But looking at this question, this topic of today, EU and multilateralism, starting from the question of how the global context is changing, I'm afraid we are actually moving towards less of a global order, a single global order. As the previous speakers have also pointed to, we see the withdrawal of the United States in many aspects from the role of a global leader. We see a very rapid rise of China, which has made the US-China competition like one of the dominant factors in international relations. And thirdly, we also see other competitors that also wish to challenge the US hegemony and kind of have a shared interest in moving towards a multipolar world order. And here Russia, of course, is one of such powers. And looking at both China and Russia, they don't necessarily want to get rid of multilateralism in the sense of wishing to destroy the existing multilateral structures. They do continue to work in the framework of the United Nations and other structures, but they do want to redefine many of the rules and norms in accordance with their worldview, their values, and their interests. And that is a challenge for the EU in particular. So Europe in this picture is in a rather complicated and uncomfortable position. Today, I don't think we can quite call the EU an independent pole in international relations. Simply the transatlantic relationship remains so hugely important for Europe. And coming from a small peripheral European NATO member, as I do, we are acutely aware of the indispensable role that the US continues to play for European security, indispensable in foreseeable future, although not necessarily permanently. And in addition, there is another factor which points to the importance of the United States for Europe. Namely, as long as we have democratic systems on both sides of the Atlantic, which are being challenged by authoritarian powers such as China and Russia, the EU and the US have a shared interest to cooperate in defending our democracies. This is primarily a domestic task, actually, and less a foreign policy one. Unfortunately, we all know how unpredictable and uncertain the partnership with the US has become, both when it comes to security issues and also to defending our shared values. And it is obvious that the US today is not the kind of ally in defending multilateralism that it has sometimes been in the past. There are issues where the EU-US tensions are evident. Many of them have been mentioned: trade, climate, human rights, also Iran, etc. But still, I would say Europe has no option but to try to do both. First, to maintain the alliance with the US, and secondly, to defend multilateralism globally, even in situations where this means taking positions that differ from those of the US. So there is a contradiction sometimes, or at least a tension between the two goals, and this is a challenge particularly for countries such as Estonia. And it is an acute issue for Estonia right now because Estonia will become an elected member of the United Nations Security Council next year. And it is really at pains with kind of combining the two priorities, the alliance with the US and defense of multilateralism, and trying to avoid clashes. But unfortunately, the clashes cannot always be avoided. Now, in a more fragmented global order, what kind of new opportunities and advantages Europe may have? I was very happy to hear from colleagues a number of very concrete ideas about what Europe can contribute, and I agree with this overall argument that the opportunities are there. Now the question is to what extent the European Union is able to use the opportunities and actually act as a defender of rules-based order and multilateralism, which is of course a very broad and multifaceted question, which then includes very different issue areas. Just to bring in one more element to this discussion, I would like to highlight the case of Ukraine, where the main worry is whether the EU remains committed to strengthening the rules-based security order in Europe, which is based on the principles of the United Nations and the OSCE. does the EU keep a consistent position in condemning Russia's actions? So this is one very important issue for the EU's credibility as a defender of multilateralism. And as we know, the unity of the EU is very fragile, and the EU's kind of actorness in the kind of security sphere has been very, very weak. On Monday, we just saw the Normandy format meeting with Russia, Ukraine, France, and Germany, which was preceded by much nervousness in Ukraine and other countries in the region about possible French and German intentions to push Ukraine to make concessions that would then mean lasting damage to Ukraine's sovereignty. Well, this did not happen, but the discussion kind of shows the fragility of the positions in the EU. Now, Ukraine is just one case in a broader picture where the US is withdrawing from global leadership, and at the same time, countries such as China and Russia and some others are expanding their influence in different parts of the world. And it is true that many other countries in this situation are actually looking towards Europe, are looking for partners to defend the rules-based order and to counterbalance the influence of Russia and China. Ukraine is part of the Eastern Partnership region, Eastern Partnership of the EU, where the European Union's role has increased considerably over the past 10 years, and where Russia is trying to hold on to its control over the Eastern Partnership countries, often with aggressive measures, but with varying degrees of success. And what we see is that all of the countries in the region are actually very keen to see a strong role of the European Union, no matter what exactly is their relationship with Russia or the EU. And we also see a very quickly strengthening role of China in that region, which has also been welcomed by the countries in the region as another factor that counterbalances the Russian influence. But as the Chinese influence is growing, it seems that these countries are also slowly becoming more aware about the political implications and the risks that may come with the Chinese presence. So again, the demand for Europe to be there is evident. Africa was mentioned also. It's an area where the growing active role of other powers may be unintendedly creating more space and demand for the EU to act and to come in as an alternative force. And here I come to the concept of geopolitical commission, which was mentioned in the beginning. Obviously, there is a need for the EU in this global context to think in a more strategic way about how it can use the opportunities that are there and how to kind of update the EU's foreign policy actorness into this world of growing kind of multipolar competition. I'm not convinced that this concept of a geopolitical commission is the best possible way to approach this challenge. I believe this is more of a conceptual issue than a substantive one. But let me just note that in foreign policy discussions, the notion of geopolitics has been strongly linked to a realist understanding of international relations as a zero-sum competition between major powers who try to achieve maximum control or influence over resources and routes and territories, etc. And it's a competition that is ultimately backed up with military power. And it is clear that the European Union is not able to become a major geopolitical power in this sense. However, it seems that the Commission is trying to give a new definition to the concept of geopolitics, or rather to put a new label for the EU on the old priority to shape and defend global rules and norms. Because this is actually what the Commission continues to underline as the most important goal of the EU's external action. So be it in the field of climate policy, trade, technology and artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, human rights, the EU's credibility as a global actor continues to be defined very strongly by its ability to defend and, where necessary, to redefine global rules and standards or to create new ones. Maybe some of you listened to the speech that the new President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, gave a couple of weeks ago to the European Parliament prior to the approval of the new Commission. She made very clear that climate policy was the new priority of the European Union, both internally and globally. It's an area that is connected with very many other policy fields. And she was very kind of strongly arguing that the EU aims to be the leader in defining new global rules and practices in order to stop global warming. Is this goal realistic? I'm not going to assess that. I'm not an expert in this particular issue, but it will be a major test to the EU's credibility now that it has been defined so strongly as a priority. What Ursula von der Leyen did not mention at all in that speech was the issue of defense, which I found a bit surprising. This is one essential area for making the European Union a more credible and sovereign international actor, or geopolitical actor, if you wish. Also, in the latest budget discussions in the Council, the planned funding for EU defense cooperation was cut down considerably. So the question that arises is, can the EU successfully defend multilateralism without developing a stronger capability to take care of its own security and security in its immediate neighborhood? Or does Europe choose to remain strongly dependent on the United States, while knowing that doing less as Europeans actually undermines the transatlantic link further? Or does the EU still aim to be a different kind of international power that does not need to be so concerned about hard security issues? So this brings us back to the question that we started with. It's how to kind of update the EU's power to define rules and norms to today's world of increasing multipolar competition. And I would end my remarks with the claim that if the EU does not become a stronger security actor, it may end up doing geopolitics of withdrawal and managing decline and leaving space for others to redefine the global rules of the game. Thank you.